A flight attendant targeted a black CEO in front of his family. But minutes later, the CEO turned the situation around and filed a lawsuit that stunned the entire airline. He tossed a black CEO father in front of his baby, thinking no one would challenge him. He didn't realize the man he attacked was about to turn the incident into a $100 billion lawsuit. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when true authority acts. The flight attendant's stare was the first thing Arian noticed, cold, unwavering, and too long for comfort. It cut through the buzz of boarding like a needle slipped between ribs. Redemar stood just past row 3, posture sharp, lips tight. The rest of the cabin crew moved like practiced actors, smiling, gesturing, helping passengers with bags. But Redden? He wasn't playing the same scene. As Dr. Arian Kelvin stepped onto Valoran Air Flight 917 with his 8-month-old son Laron secured to his chest in a Navy sling, Redden's eyes didn't follow protocol. They locked on a target. No greeting, no professional nod, just a flick of the jaw and a stiffening of the shoulders, like the moment before a warning goes off in a cockpit. Arian registered it silently. He kept walking, scanning the rows for his seat. 7A, window. He nodded politely at other passengers as he passed, even as Laron squirmed gently under his coat, sensing a change in his father's breathing. The cabin smelled of citrus and metal. Overhead lights bathed the interior in a sterile white, bright enough to chase shadows but not suspicion. As he buckled in, Arian double-checked Laron's chest harness, then gave him a soft pat. "Just 2 hours, little man," he whispered, keeping his voice steady. "Then we make history." He meant it. In Crestholme, a merger worth over $1 billion waited on a single vote. The data in his briefcase contained validation algorithms, compliance protocols, and a security audit that could either greenlight or kill a cross-continental merger. He was the deciding voice. His presence in that boardroom wasn't symbolic, it was structural. That's why this flight mattered. That's why everything needed to go smoothly. But when Arian glanced forward again, Redden was still watching. Not checking bags, not assisting other passengers, just standing near the galley wall, holding a small tablet close to his chest, the screen faintly glowing. For a moment, Arian could have sworn he saw something unusual flash on the display, his own seat number. Arian squinted, but Redden turned the screen away. And then came the smile. Not toward him, of course, but to the older white man walking down the aisle behind him. "Welcome aboard, sir," Redden said cheerfully, even reaching to help with the man's bag. The change in tone was so sharp it whiplashed. Then, once the man passed, Redden's mouth flattened again as he made eye contact with Arian. Something flickered in that stare. Calculation, contempt, or worse, expectation. Arian didn't respond. Years of boardrooms, audits, and interviews had taught him the power of stillness. Instead, he reached for the inside of his coat, where his phone rested in a concealed breast pocket. With a discreet press, he started a background voice recording app. Just in case. He didn't know why yet, but his instincts whispered louder than logic. A quiet chime signaled final boarding. Passengers settled in. A mother, too, rows ahead, bounced her baby gently on her shoulder, while a young man behind Arian adjusted his gaming console. Cabin noise blended into a humming drone, like an orchestra tuning before a performance. Then Laron gave a soft cry. It wasn't loud. Not yet. Just a coo, followed by a hiccup and a fuss. Arian gently rocked him, whispering the melody of the lullaby he'd sung back home. But Redden's head snapped around from the front of the plane with a speed that felt too eager. He said nothing, just glared, then muttered under his breath. Arian tilted his head slightly, barely able to hear. But the words reached him like a signal through static. "Protocol behavior," he frowned. "What protocol? Babies cried on flights all the time. Was there a regulation he wasn't aware of?" Redden walked back toward the galley, but not before taking one last long look over his shoulder at Arian, not the baby. Dramatic irony painted itself across the cabin in thin, invisible strokes. Redden smiled and assisted other passengers as they settled in. Joked with a tall man in row 4. Shared a laugh with a first-class couple before the divider curtain. But every time he passed row 7, his expression tightened. Arian leaned back slightly, the soft buzz of the engine starting to rise. He tried to push the unease down. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe the merger stress was coloring his perception. Maybe this was just a difficult flight attendant, nothing more. But the instinct didn't leave. Something was off. Not loud, not clear, but present, like wind against glass before a storm. He glanced at the overhead bin again, confirming his briefcase was locked securely above. Inside, encrypted documents pulsed with the power to change the industry. But now, Arian wondered, was the danger really only in the boardroom? The captain's voice broke over the intercom, calm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 917 to Crest Home. Estimated flight time will be 1 hour and 54 minutes. We ask that all devices be set to airplane mode." Arian followed the instructions, placing his phone screen down beside him while the recorder still ran beneath his coat. Laron had quieted now, eyes wide and blinking up at the cabin lights. Then the lights dimmed. A soft click, a change in the cabin tone. That subtle moment when a plane shifts from boarding to sealed. The same moment Redden turned, gave one last long stare down the aisle, and locked eyes with Arian, holding that gaze just a second too long, as if to remember his face, as if something had just started. The hum of the engines grew louder. The seatbelt sign lit, and as the cabin crew moved into final takeoff positions, a single sentence pulsed inside Arian's thoughts like a radar ping in a dark sea. This was the moment the sky quietly chose sides. Arian had just begun humming softly, rocking Laron in slow, rhythmic motions when a shadow fell across him. He looked up and found Redden Marr standing stiffly in the aisle, arms crossed, jaw locked. The overhead lights cast sharp lines across the attendant's face, hardening his expression. "That humming," Redden said, his voice clipped, "is becoming a disturbance to other passengers." Arian blinked, momentarily thrown off. All around the cabin, the ambient sound of crying babies, beeping seatbelt signs, and the low drone of the engines filled the space. His hum had been barely audible, more of a calming vibration in Laron's ear than a tune for the cabin. "I'm just trying to calm my son," Arian said gently, keeping his voice steady, careful. "It helps him sleep." Redden didn't budge. His eyes flicked down to Laron, who squirmed and let out a tiny whimper. Then, back to Arian with renewed sharpness. "We'll determine what helps and what disturbs," Redden replied, his tone oddly rehearsed. "This is a shared environment." Something in the wording chilled Arian. Not just the authority, but the precision. He nodded once. More to defuse than to agree. "Understood." Redden lingered for a moment longer, scanning Arian's face as if committing it to memory, then turned and walked away. Arian exhaled slowly. He didn't like the way Redden had approached, too fast, too confrontational, as if he'd already decided a rule had been broken and only needed to find the right one to quote. Laron shifted again, fussing now. His cheeks reddened. His hands clutched the front of Arian's jacket. The bottle was still half full. Arian reached toward the call button, pressing it once. He needed warm water to prepare a fresh feed. A different attendant came over, a younger man, dark hair, slicked neatly back. "Could I get some warm water for his bottle?" Arian asked politely, holding up the bottle. Before the attendant could answer, Redden reappeared behind him like a shadow. "That's not permitted right now," Redden said firmly, stepping forward. "We're in an early flight phase, and you're interfering with safety procedures." The other attendant hesitated, glanced between them, then backed away. "I've flown dozens of times with him," Arian replied, keeping his voice calm. "This is routine. I'm not interfering, just feeding my child." Redden stepped closer. "That's your interpretation," he said, leaning down slightly. "Let me be clear, when you deviate from standard protocols, even for personal needs, it becomes a safety issue." Behind his words, there was something else, something more than policy. A power play. Arian nodded slowly, then leaned back in his seat. His hand brushed the inside of his blazer. The phone he had hidden in the chest pocket blinked silently, recording. He'd hit the button right after boarding, more out of instinct than paranoia. Now he was grateful. All right, Arian said evenly. I'll wait. Redden didn't move. He stared for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod to the attendant behind him. The younger man subtly tilted his head, as if receiving a silent instruction. Arian caught the exchange, and something twisted in his gut. That wasn't a routine interaction. That was coordination. Laron began fussing again, wriggling in his harness. Arian unbuckled one strap to adjust his position. Before he could finish, Redden snapped forward. Remain seated. Do not unbuckle without instruction. There's no turbulence, Arian said, startled. He's just sliding down. I'm adjusting him. Remain seated, Redden repeated, louder this time, cutting off Arian with authority. Across the aisle, a passenger turned. Someone in row 7 leaned forward. Arian could feel eyes on him now. He slowly lifted both hands. I'm seated, he said clearly. I'm not resisting. Just taking care of my son. Redden didn't respond. He remained in place, as if daring Arian to move again. Behind him, the other attendant stepped sideways, subtly creating a physical block across the aisle. The space was becoming smaller, tighter, intentional. Laron began to cry harder now, his voice high-pitched and distressed. Arian bounced his legs slightly, whispering to him under his breath. It's okay, buddy. Daddy's here. Redden's expression didn't shift. He showed no empathy, no recognition of the child's distress. Only calculation. You're creating a disruption, Redden said coldly. Arian shook his head slowly. No, he said. I'm containing one. A low murmur rippled from a few rows back. Whispering. Someone muttered, What's going on? Another voice answered, I think he's being singled out. Arian didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He knew too well how easily perception could be weaponized. This is about control, he thought. Not safety, not noise. He could feel the line being drawn. Redden was trying to force a reaction. Something visible, something he could use. And Arian wasn't going to give it to him. Instead, he leaned his head gently against Laron's and kept his voice soft, letting the hum return, barely audible. Redden stood motionless, but his eyes flicked again to the younger attendant. Another silent cue passed. Arian's heart pounded, not from fear, but from calculation. They were preparing something, a coordinated moment, and they thought he wouldn't see it coming. But he had seen power misused before, on boards, in acquisitions, in audits masked as favors. This was the same tactic with a different uniform. The baby's cries rose, but Arian didn't move. He focused on his breathing, steady and deep, anchoring himself. Laron's weight on his chest reminded him what mattered. Every second was a decision. To hold still, to outlast the provocation, to make sure the record told the true story. As the whispers grew behind him and Redden retreated just a few steps, something sharpened in the air, a pressure that hadn't been there before. Arian didn't know where this would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. The air trembled with a warning only a father could hear. Redemar moved without a word. No warning, no raised voice. Just a sudden, calculated reach under his apron. Arian Kelvin barely had time to register the movement before pain exploded through his side like a bolt of lightning. The twin prongs of a black stun device pressed directly into his rib cage, deliberate, cold, and brutal. His spine arched from the shock, a guttural sound escaping his throat as his arms instinctively clamped around his son, shielding the 8-month-old body strapped to his chest. Laron let out a terrified, broken wail, high-pitched, panicked, and pure. The infant's tiny fists thrashed against Arian's collarbone, feeling the ripple of agony vibrating through his father's body. Gasps erupted from the rows around them. Someone screamed. A tray clattered to the floor, metal ringing like a warning bell. But Redden stepped back slowly, calmly, as though what he'd just done was routine, perhaps even justified. His eyes scanned the passengers without flinching. No apology, no explanation, just control. Arian's mind struggled to catch up with his body. His breath came in jagged pulls, teeth clenched tight against the scream rising in his throat. He forced it down. He could not collapse. He would not drop his son. His right arm locked around Laron like a shield, his left hand clutching the seat arm to stay upright. The pain still clawed through his chest, but his focus zeroed in on one thing: stay awake. "Sir, you were warned," Redden announced loudly, his voice coated in a rehearsed calm that sounded nearly sociopathic in the aftermath. "You refused to follow crew instructions." That response was within protocol. "No warning." Arian gasped, the words torn from him through grit teeth. "You never gave me anything." His voice cracked, but his tone held steady. The co-pilot, who had walked through the cabin just 10 minutes earlier, now stood near the galley door. He gave Redden a slow, deliberate nod. Not a glance of concern, not even confusion. It was the kind of nod exchanged between men carrying out an operation already agreed upon. Arian saw it. So did two other passengers near row 9. One of them turned to the other, mouthing silently. He wanted this to happen. And suddenly, everything sharpened. The earlier stares, the tension, the refusal to let him adjust Laron's harness. The strange phrase, protocol behavior. It hadn't been about compliance or safety. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a script, and Arian had just been forced into its climax. Redden took a step forward, holding the device casually at his side like a baton of authority. "Remain seated. We'll be addressing your conduct upon landing." Arian felt his heart race faster, but his mind began shifting gears. They're building a case, painting him as hostile, as dangerous, as unstable, all while his son still clung to him, crying from pain and confusion. The attendants were moving now, 2 men from the rear cabin, forming a casual wall in the aisle. Their bodies blocked passengers from filming. One even tilted his shoulder slightly, obscuring the angle of the phone raised discreetly across the row. But they missed one detail. Arian's blazer had a custom inner pocket stitch just above his heart, and inside it, clipped to the lining, his phone had been recording video since before takeoff. It was angled perfectly down the narrow aisle and across the 2 middle seats, capturing every second of Redden's aggression, every word, every movement, and now, the exact moment the device discharged against his ribcage. His pain had a purpose now. His silence had ammunition. A male passenger toward the back shouted, "What just happened?" "He has a baby." "Sit down, sir," one attendant barked back. "This does not concern you." But it did. It concerned all of them, because the cabin wasn't just an aircraft anymore. It had become a sealed chamber of confrontation, every second ticking by added heat to the pressure. And Arian knew deep in his gut, that if he didn't take control of his narrative now, the crew would. The fire in his ribs pulsed, still burning, but beneath it something else stirred. Not rage, not fear, something colder, more deliberate. They think I'll break. They're counting on it. But Arian was done playing by their rules. He leaned back slowly, checking Laron's breathing with a hand to the infant's chest. It was fast, too fast, but steady. Arian whispered to him, his lips close to the boy's ear. "I've got you. I promise you're safe." He didn't believe that yet, but he needed his son to hear it anyway. One of the attendants stepped closer, whispering something into Redden's ear. Redden nodded, glancing once more at Arian, not with frustration now, but something worse, satisfaction. Like a man who just crossed a line he thought would never be challenged. Arian stared back. No words, just unbroken eye contact. And in that moment, something passed between them, an unspoken realization that the story wasn't going the way Redden planned. The device had done its damage, but the real weapon was still rolling quietly inside Arian's jacket pocket. And soon, the whole world would see it. Pain shot through him, but the fire in his resolve burned brighter. Arian's back arched against the seat as the current coursed through him, his teeth clenched tight against the cry rising in his throat. Laron wailed, sharp, terrified, alive. The echo of the stunned device hadn't yet faded from the cabin when Redden straightened, turned toward the aisle like an actor exiting stage right, and announced loudly, "The captain has been notified. He'll be handling this passenger incident upon landing." Every syllable was a blade, framing Arian not as the victim, but as the problem. His mind, still scrambled from a jolt, fought to reset. Pain raced through his ribs, but he pulled Laron closer, protecting his son's fragile body with the only shield he had left, himself. Two male attendants emerged from the galley with restraint straps in hand. They moved methodically, without urgency, but with unmistakable purpose, like men completing a protocol already rehearsed. One of them, a lean, bald man with gray around his temples, looked at Arian not with concern, but with the calm indifference of someone securing cargo. "I've complied with everything," Arian said, voice low but steady, straining through clenched breath. "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't disobeyed a single order. My son is 8 months old. I will not allow you to restrain me." The bald attendant didn't respond. Neither did Redden. Instead, Redden leaned slightly toward the other crew member beside him and muttered something under his breath. Arian's ears were still ringing, but he caught 2 words clear as glass: internal flag. Arian froze. He didn't know what that meant, but the way Redden said it, with that cruel hint of satisfaction, sounded like he wasn't just following orders. He was acting on a label, one Arian hadn't even known existed, and passengers weren't supposed to be labeled. Around them, the cabin teetered in awkward silence. A few murmurs stirred from nearby seats. Eyes darted, then quickly turned away. Most didn't understand what had just happened. Others didn't want to. A crying black man with a baby in his arms could be anyone's problem as long as it wasn't theirs. And yet, something shifted. A man in the aisle row, mid-30s, dressed in business casual with rolled-up sleeves, leaned over slightly and let something drop beneath Arian's seat. Arian glanced down, heart pounding. A pen. No, closer inspection showed a tiny red dot blinking from the tip. "A camera." The man leaned toward him again and whispered, "It's on. Angle's good. I got most of it." "Stay seated." Arian didn't get a chance to thank him. The plane suddenly rocked in a low, sweeping motion. Not violent, but enough to stir alarm. Overhead bins clattered slightly. The captain's voice came over the intercom, clipped and official. "Due to minor turbulence, all passengers must remain in their seats with belts fastened. Do not move around the cabin." A convenient decree, one that locked Arian in a place just as the threat around him narrowed. The turbulence felt manufactured, timed too precisely to be natural. Arian's fingers curled tighter around Laron's back as the baby hiccuped through exhausted cries, his head buried beneath his father's chin. One of the attendants buckled the restraint straps around his arm, testing tension, then paused, as if awaiting confirmation. Redden watched without blinking. Suddenly, a figure appeared near the galley, an unfamiliar male crew member, younger, slender, wearing the flight engineer's badge. He hovered, clearly out of place. His eyes flicked from Arian to the straps, then to the stun device that still hung from Redden's side. The engineer didn't speak, but his lips parted slightly as though he wanted to. Instead, he swallowed hard, then turned away. Arian caught it. That micro-expression, nervous recognition. He knows the stun device isn't approved. He knows it wasn't supposed to be used. And he's afraid. Arian's mind sharpened through the fog. His objective became crystalline. Do not resist, do not panic, and do not let them take away control of the story. The only way out was through logic, patience, and proof. And right now, proof was rolling inside his jacket, beneath the seat, and maybe even in the quiet eyes of men who had started to doubt the script they were handed. He shifted slightly, whispering to Laron, "It's okay. I've got you. We're not done yet." His voice was gentle, not for Redden, not for the crew, for his son, to remind him, and himself, that this wasn't the end of anything. It was a test, one they had to survive. From across the aisle, a voice whispered, "This isn't right." A passenger, unseen. The tide was changing, slowly. Redden adjusted his collar and looked down at Arian one last time, narrowing his eyes. But something flickered behind them, doubt, or maybe realization. He'd expected fear. Instead, he saw strategy. Arian didn't speak. He didn't need to anymore. His silence became the strongest weapon he had left. "He attacked me first." The words ripped through the cabin like static through a radio, loud enough to draw heads, but slippery enough to sound official. Redden Marr's voice carried authority, but to Arian Kelvern, strapped into his seat with his infant son Laron clinging to his chest, it sounded more like a line rehearsed in the mirror. The flight attendant wasn't shouting. He was performing, planting the seeds of a story he wanted others to believe. Arian stared at him, lips pressed together, pain still radiating from the spot where the stun device had been pressed against his ribs. But Redden didn't flinch. He turned deliberately toward the passengers in the surrounding rows, gesturing with a practiced motion toward Arian, as if to say, "You saw what you saw." But they hadn't. Arian had barely moved. The only motion he'd made was the instinctive curl of his body to shield Laron. And yet Redden stood tall, fabricating a version of events with the ease of someone who had done this before and gotten away with it. A low murmur began to rise from the cabin, soft, uncertain. Some passengers leaned toward each other, whispering questions they were too afraid to speak aloud. Others simply looked away, faces stiff with discomfort. Arian could feel the tide of perception shifting, just as Redden intended. Then a voice cut clean through the tension. "That's not true." The words came steady and firm from seat 11C. A man stood up, tall and composed, his blazer folded neatly over one arm. His face was calm, but his eyes were alert, razor-sharp with intent. He stepped into the aisle, revealing himself fully to the cabin for the first time. "My name is Talvin Reese," he said, his voice carrying with quiet gravity. "I'm an internal auditor for Valorn Air. Off-duty, yes, but still within rights to observe protocol." He turned toward Redden and took a single step forward. "And I'm warning you, what you just claimed is a false statement. And the use of that stun device on a seated passenger, especially with a child in his arms, is a federal offense under Title 49 of the Civil Aeronautics Code." A silence fell over the row like a heavy cloth. Even Redden blinked, momentarily caught between disbelief and calculation. He hadn't expected a challenge, certainly not from someone with credentials. "You don't have the authority," Redden began, but his voice faltered slightly. "I don't need authority to speak the truth," Talvin replied coolly, stepping fully into the aisle. "Every camera in this cabin stores 3 hours of rolling footage, and every second of that footage will be reviewed when we land, including the moment you activated an unapproved weapon against a father who had not moved from his seat." Arian blinked slowly, watching this man, this stranger, intervene with quiet power. He didn't know who Talvin was, not really, but in that moment, he became the first human shield Arian hadn't had to build for himself. Redden stood motionless, his hands curled behind his back, gripping the strap he'd used earlier like a lifeline. His face didn't twitch, but something behind his eyes did, panic flickering beneath practiced arrogance. The captain's voice broke in over the intercom, unusually curt. "Flight, lead to the cockpit." Immediately, Redden hesitated. For a moment, Arian thought he might ignore the order. But then, with a forced exhale through his nose, he turned on his heel and disappeared toward the front of the plane. The cabin buzzed as whispers picked up again, louder this time. The illusion had cracked. Talvin turned toward Arian and lowered his voice. "You're not alone. I saw the whole thing. I'll file a report as soon as we touch down." Arian nodded once, grateful but guarded. Why would he do it? Why me? Talvin glanced toward the cockpit, his voice now barely audible. "Because Redmar has been under review for 6 months. Passenger treatment complaints, code violations, incidents that got buried. But someone keeps shielding him." He looked Arian in the eye. "This wasn't random. I think you were flagged before the flight even left the gate." A chill spread through Arian's chest that had nothing to do with altitude. The pain in his side flared again, and Laron whimpered against him, his tiny hands clutching the folds of Arian's shirt. Arian rocked gently, trying to calm him, but his mind was racing. Flagged, targeted, silenced. Was it about the email he'd sent 2 weeks ago? The one warning about underreported maintenance errors tied to Valorn's regional fleet? Was someone afraid of what he might say if that merger went through? Talvin leaned closer, voice firm. "Preserve your evidence. Don't delete a second of what you've recorded. Don't give your phone to anyone." "I won't," Arian said. His tone was calm, but his pulse thundered. He looked around the cabin, faces of men who had watched everything, eyes darting between right and wrong, unsure which way to lean. Some looked at him now with sympathy. others with fear or guilt. But none of them said a word. A slight jolt rolled through the plane as the aircraft dipped again. The fasten seatbelt sign lit up overhead. The captain was trying to control the environment, keep everything still. But everything was moving now. Laron had quieted slightly, sensing that his father's arms were no longer trembling. Arian adjusted the wrap, holding him close, brushing a hand gently across his son's back. In that moment, he didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a shield, a wall, a witness. And the longer he sat silent, the more dangerous that silence became for him, for Laron, and for every man who might one day sit in this same seat, wondering if dignity could survive 30,000 feet. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a stage, a battle of narratives. And Redden had fired the first shot. Talvin gave one last warning. They'll try something else before landing. Be ready. Arian nodded, resting his chin lightly against Laron's head. The sky had shown its cruelty, but the ground would demand its truth. When Redden returned from the cockpit, the change in his demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. Gone was the performative irritation, the flared nostrils, the clipped tone, the exaggerated size of supposed burden. In its place settled a colder, eerily mechanical expression, as though something behind that closed door had whispered a new directive into his spine. He moved with a false calm now, the kind that didn't speak of resolution, but of premeditation. Arian noticed it instantly, the way Redden's eyes no longer searched for reactions, but instead locked in on a single target with chilling focus. His posture had stiffened, shoulders squared like a soldier walking back into a plan he didn't author but had already agreed to carry out. Without introduction or context, Redden stepped into the aisle and stopped directly beside Arian's row. "You will hand over the child now," he said flatly. "For safety inspection." Arian blinked. "What inspection?" Redden's tone remained unchanged. "Cabin protocol. We need to confirm the harness is secure and safe for landing." Arian kept his arms around Laron, the child's tiny frame tucked against his chest, sleeping fitfully through the rising unease. "You don't inspect infants by separating them from their parents," Arian said calmly. "There's no such protocol in airline policy." Redden did not answer. Instead, his hand dropped instinctively to the folded restraint straps on his belt, fingers curling around the canvas like he was waiting for the slightest excuse to move. Around them, the cabin stayed painfully silent. Passengers stared, but not with resistance. With resignation. The kind of silence that believes uniforms can't be questioned, that obedience is survival. Arian could feel their stares crawling across his back like insects, each one confirming that no help would come from those seated nearby. Talvin rose from his seat without warning. "That's enough," the auditor said, stepping into the aisle with calm but unmistakable authority. "Unless you have a federal warrant or an immediate medical emergency, you have no right to separate a parent from his child, especially not after your previous violation." Redden didn't look at Talvin. He didn't even blink. He simply stepped back half an inch, as though buying time for a different instruction to arrive. "You're interfering with a crew procedure," Redden said. Talvin held up his credentials like a blade. "You interfere with the Federal Safety Investigators Authority," he replied, "and this airline won't have a license left to fly rubber balloons." That got the cabin's attention. Murmurs spread now, whispers behind clasped hands. Even one of the male attendants near the rear seemed to hesitate, his eyes flicking toward the cockpit. Something was shifting, and then it happened. As Redden stood his ground, one of the other male crew members, tall, pale, his uniform slightly rumpled, made a small, seemingly casual move. He walked toward the service cabinet, paused, then quickly slid a dark gray tablet from a shelf and slipped it into the inner pocket of his jacket. The motion was smooth, deliberate. Too deliberate. Arian saw it. So did Talvin. Their eyes met briefly, both registering the same thing. Someone had just removed or protected a piece of digital evidence. Arian's thoughts sharpened. That tablet wasn't for drinks or manifests. It was most likely a control panel or internal monitoring interface. And if someone had just hidden it, that meant there was something on it worth hiding. Possibly instructions. Possibly logs. Possibly a list. A quiet dread began rising in his chest, but he forced it back down with measured breath. Laron stirred, shifting slightly in his carrier with a tired grunt. Arian's arms tightened around him gently, the motion both protective and soothing. "You're not taking him," Arian said, more to the cabin than to Redden now. "He is secure. He is not in danger. He is not part of your game." Redden stepped forward again, his hand twitching his belt, but Talvin moved with him. The two stood almost toe-to-toe now, neither blinking. "You go through with this," Talvin said quietly, "and I make one call when we land. And I promise you, your badge won't open a single door inside an airport again." It was Redden's turn to hesitate. But it wasn't fear on his face, it was calculation. Like he was measuring the cost of failure, not the risk of being wrong. Behind them, the cabin lights flickered. Not enough to cause alarm. Not enough to suggest a system failure. Just enough to feel like a whisper from the plane itself, reminding everyone that this was a sealed metal vessel flying through the sky with secrets clinging to its walls. Arian breathed in deeply. He tilted his head down, pressing his cheek against Laron's soft curls. "I promise you, little one," he whispered, "you will not be taken or harmed again tonight." The plane droned on above the clouds, the engines humming beneath a silence no one dared break. Arian's mind remained razor-sharp, scanning each detail, the tucked tablet, the flicker of lights, the silent attendant watching too closely. Something was inside this cabin, and it wasn't just fear. It was something written, something planned, something approved behind a door passengers were never meant to see. And all the while, Redden stood in the aisle, no longer speaking, no longer commanding. Just watching, waiting. The line between action and threat drawn so thin it could tear at any moment. The air felt like a warning wrapped in metal. The plane jolted slightly, a ripple of turbulence shaking overhead bins and sending a faint rattle through loose seat buckles. In the dim cabin light, shadows danced briefly across passengers' tense faces. Arian Kelvin gripped the seat armrest with one hand, the other instinctively shielding his son Laron against his chest. His eyes narrowed when he saw Reddenmar step forward, seizing the moment of instability like a wolf lunging in fog. "Passenger is resisting security protocol," Redden barked with theatrical aggression, reaching out toward Arian's left arm. Before the flight attendant's hand could make contact, Talvin rose from seat 11C with a suddenness that cut through the cabin like a crack of thunder. "Step back," Talvin said, voice low but unwavering. His stance was firm, body slightly angled in defense, as he wedged himself between Arian and Redden. "This crew has already violated 5 major safety codes. You touch him again, and this flight is grounded by federal intervention before the wheels even drop." Redden's hand paused midair. His lips pressed into a hard line, and for a split second, the fire behind his eyes flickered, not with authority, but with uncertainty. Around them, passengers held their breath, caught in a moment that felt both surreal and dangerous. The hum of the engines filled the silence, but it was Talvin's words that roared. "You have no legal cause, no captain's authorization on record, and no lawful reason to restrain this man," Talvin continued. "The moment you used that stun device, you broke federal regulation, unless you want to test that in court." Redden hesitated, his jaw tightening. But instead of retreating, he clung to his stance with desperation. "This passenger was flagged under special protocol. I'm following internal directive, red line." His voice was lower now, less for show and more for justification. Arian's brows knit. "What did you just say?" "Protocol red line," Redden repeated, quieter, almost as if he'd let something slip. "High-risk designation. Corporate threat." The words echoed in Arian's ears like a slow detonation. Something inside him shifted, an awareness deeper than instinct, more pointed than fear. Bits of memory began rearranging in his mind like falling shards finding their fit. The strange email from an anonymous sender warning him not to fly. The maintenance reports he'd questioned at Valoran Air's last compliance review. The old engineer who hinted during a call, "Some planes stay airborne longer than they should because people stay quiet." You're saying I'm on a list? Arian asked, voice steady, though his heart thudded harder beneath Laron's small body. You think I'm a risk because I flagged unsafe parts? Redden said nothing, but the twitch in his eyes answered for him. Talvin pivoted toward Arian, his voice quieter now, for him alone. Redline isn't for safety threats, it's for corporate ones. Whistleblowers. Anyone who speaks too loud. They're not supposed to apply it to passengers. Arian's breath caught in his throat. His objective shifted in that instant, not just survive this flight, but uncover who placed his name on that list and why. The danger was no longer a random act of aggression. It was systematic. Meanwhile, Redden straightened, trying to collect what authority he thought he still had. There's no recordable evidence this list even exists, he snapped, attempting to dismiss the revelation. But the way he avoided Arian's eyes, the tremor in his fingers as they rested near the restraint strap, betrayed the truth. He knew he'd said too much, and now the truth had found an audience. Dramatic irony bloomed in the cabin like slow smoke. Redden had no idea about the jacket camera still recording from Arian's chest, or the pin camera quietly dropped under the seat hours earlier. Nor did he realize that Talvin wasn't just any off-duty employee. He was an internal auditor who had seen Redline's name whispered in closed meetings. Arian adjusted Laron gently against his chest, feeling the baby stir from the tension in the air. You feel that too, don't you? He whispered to his son, lips brushing the infant's ear. We're not just flying anymore. The division in the cabin was palpable. Some passengers looked away, shielding their faces in fear of involvement. But others, especially those who had seen the stun incident, watched with mounting outrage. They might not have spoken yet, but Arian could feel it in their eyes. They were no longer fooled by Redden's performance. Redden stepped back, shoulders squared, but his confidence fraying around the edges. You're escalating this. Not me. No, Talvin said flatly. You escalated the moment you brought force into a cabin without cause. Another passenger in row 9 leaned slightly into the aisle, enough to see the confrontation, but not enough to intervene. Still, it was one more silent witness. Arian inhaled deeply, the air around him thick with tension and recirculated doubt. Every movement, every exchange now felt like it was happening on the edge of a blade. His thoughts raced, not with panic but with precision. He had the footage. He had the witnesses. He had Talvin. And now, he had a name, Redline. A lie that big leaves cracks, even fear cannot cover. He smirked, confident the act would go unpunished, unaware that every moment, every witness, and every legal avenue was already being prepared. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when faced with strategy and law, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The captain's voice slammed into the cabin like a gavel against steel. All passengers remain seated. Interference with crew duties will result in legal detention upon landing. The words echoed with unnatural weight. Not procedural, personal. Arian Kelvin tightened his grip around his son, Laron, whose small body instinctively burrowed closer into his chest. The air pressure had nothing to do with altitude anymore. It was authority pressing down like an invisible hand, and Arian knew immediately this warning wasn't for the passengers. It was for him. Across the aisle, Reddenmar stood like a soldier at post, arms behind his back, chin lifted just enough to catch the glow of the overhead lights. He wasn't watching the cabin. He was watching Arian, unblinking, unflinching, as though waiting for one flinch, one step, one flicker of resistance. But Arian didn't move. His objective had crystallized into a single, precise mission: stay unrestrained until wheels hit ground. If he was locked down, they could seize the cameras. If they seized the cameras, the truth would vanish into corporate shadows. Then, without warning, the quiet man in seat 3A moved. Arian saw it in peripheral motion first, a slow lean, a calculated reach. The man didn't stand, didn't whisper, didn't blink. He merely unfolded a small black ID card from his inner coat and held it between two fingers, discreetly angled toward Arian's line of sight. Crest Home Federal Safety Bureau. The words pulsed under a government seal like a heartbeat in metal. Arian's breath stilled. The man's lips barely moved. "I boarded because of you," he whispered. "Anonymous alert. Someone predicted this. They said there'd be tampering. High-profile passenger. You." Arian's mind reeled. Someone had warned the agency before the flight even took off. Not just a whistleblower after the fact. Someone on the inside had seen this coming. "Your name came attached to risk flags," the investigator murmured, voice steady but urgent. "And one note, he will be targeted in flight. Watch the crew, not the passenger." He slid his jacket slightly, revealing a micro camera pinned to his collar. "I've been recording since we left the ground. I caught the stun, the threats, everything." The investigator sat back without another word, vanishing in a posture like a ghost returning to his shell. Arian didn't move, but behind his eyes, everything shifted. A second layer of protection existed now. He wasn't just defending himself. He was being defended from an angle the airline never saw coming. But danger remained. The cockpit. Arian remembered what the investigator had said. They may try to delete the cabin footage before landing. He looked down at Laron, whose tiny fists were clutching his shirt, knuckles pale, breath shallow. Arian whispered, "You're okay, son. I've got you. No one's taking you. Not now. Not ever." The baby stirred but didn't cry. He could feel his father's resolve, like steel shielding soft flesh. Redden's stare intensified. He had noticed the interaction. He hadn't heard the words, but he sensed the shift. A predator feels it when prey stops running. The illusion of control wavered, and for a second, Redden's fingers twitched by his thigh, as if measuring whether he could reach the restraints before being stopped. He didn't move, but the tension hummed between them like a live wire. Then came a sound, subtle, ominous, the soft descent tone. Arian felt the cabin tilt slightly forward, a smooth but unmistakable signal. They were descending. And suddenly, everything inside the aircraft grew still. Passengers leaned back instinctively. Bags rustled. Lights dimmed. The descent had begun. The final act had started. Redden checked his wrist device, just a flick of his eyes, and Arian saw it. A message. Short. Direct. Redden's jaw locked. He didn't read it twice. Whatever it was, it gave him a new resolve. He shifted his weight forward, as if readying to lunge. Arian leaned back, one arm instinctively curling around Laron's head. He braced, heart thudding, calculating every angle, where his knees would block, where his torso could shield. He didn't need to win a fight. He needed to survive 10 more minutes with the truth intact. Then a whisper came from behind Redden's shadow. "You're surrounded by the truth, and you don't even see it," came the investigator's voice again, soft and lethal. Redden froze, eyes narrowing. No one moved. Every seat became a silent witness. Every breath was an unspoken verdict. Arian exhaled slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply stared back at Redden, not with anger, not with fear, but with the unshakable clarity of a father who had been hunted and had chosen not to run. Outside the window, the lights of Crestholme blinked into view beneath a sheet of clouds. The city was rising to meet them, runway lights stretching like a path made of truth. And still no one moved. No straged, no orders, just the quiet tension of a plan unraveling. The truth was no longer hiding. It was circling the cabin like a shadow, waiting for its moment. The descent began violently. Without warning, the aircraft tilted forward in a steep pitch that caused overhead bins to creak and several passengers to clutch their armrests. The seatbelt sign blazed red, but the captain's voice didn't come on. It was as if even he wanted silence, one final stretch of confusion before the wheels hit the ground. But Arian Kelvern felt the shift for what it was. Not turbulence, not standard ascent, but a rushed effort to land before control of the story could slip away. Across the aisle, Reddenmar stood rigid, his eyes locked on the small, glowing display embedded in his wrist device. A single message blinked once, then disappeared. His jaw clenched. Without a word, he stepped forward, tightening his grip on the black nylon restraints looped around his hand. His intent was unmistakable. Arian's body tensed, instinctively curving protectively over Laron, who stirred in his carrier with a soft, whimpering cry. Arian could already see the headlines they try to craft. Passenger becomes combative during landing, security measures justified. One move, one moment of forced restraint, and they would seize the narrative and possibly the cameras. He couldn't let that happen. Don't, Arian said low, his voice clear and unwavering. I won't let you touch him. Redden didn't answer. He took another step forward, the edge of the restraint gleaming faintly in the cabin lights. Around them, the aisle was silent, passengers frozen in fear and disbelief. No one reached for their phones. No one moved. It was as if the whole plane had stopped breathing. Then a voice rang out. Steady. Sharp. That's far enough. The federal investigator from seat 3A stood, badge raised in one hand, the other gripping the edge of the seat for balance. His gaze was locked on Redden. Any attempt to restrain this passenger now, he said firmly, will be recorded as obstruction of a federal inquiry. You'll be violating jurisdiction. I'll see to it personally. Gasps echoed from a few nearby rows. The balance of power had shifted. Redden faltered, just slightly, but enough for Arian to notice the flicker of panic that darted across his face. For a man who had acted with full authority just minutes ago, his hands now trembled faintly against the restraint. He looked not at Arian, but at the badge. Talvin rose from seat 11C, holding his tablet. Check this, he muttered, flicking rapidly through screens. We've got it. He turned the screen toward the aisle where the investigator stood. The cockpit tried to purge the cabin video logs 60 seconds ago, but the system locked them out. Redden's head snapped toward Talvin. You what? Triggered a security protocol when the investigator's badge synced with the flight server. Talvin replied calmly. Your little plan? It's dead. The plane shuddered again, a rough jolt that sent more bags bumping inside their compartments, one thumping audibly near the back. The symbolism wasn't lost on Arian. The plan was collapsing. Redden looked between Talvin, the investigator, and Arian. His face had gone pale, the bravado drained from it like air from a balloon. He tried to muster something, authority, confidence, maybe an excuse, but it came out as silence. Arian shifted, still crouched protectively over Laron, but now lifting his eyes. His breathing was calm, but deliberate, every nerve on alert. His objective had narrowed down to three things. Protect Laron, protect the evidence, and walk off this aircraft untouched. The finish line was close, but the danger was still real. Redden's knuckles whitened on the restraint as he took a step forward again, desperation flickering behind his expression. He opened his mouth. Touch him, the investigator said, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of nearly every passenger. And this plane won't take off again for a year. Redden froze mid-step. His mouth stayed open, but no words emerged. The silence returned, this time suffocating him, not Arian. Around them, the cabin was no longer neutral. Even the passengers who'd remained quiet now leaned forward with narrowed eyes, some nodding subtly, others staring with barely contained contempt. The lie had cracked wide open. Outside, the glow of the arrival city shimmered through the small, oval windows. A curtain of cloud parted to reveal the runway lights blinking steadily, waiting like witnesses. Landing gear extended with a deep, mechanical groan. The weight of the moment pressed into every inch of metal and flesh aboard the aircraft. Arian exhaled slowly, lowering his forehead briefly to Laron's head. The child had stopped whimpering and now blinked up with wide, tired eyes. In his son's small heartbeat, Arian found the tempo he needed, not just of survival, but a preparation for the war to come. And so, as the wheels dropped and the city rushed upward beneath them, the story shifted from survival to reckoning. The ground below was waiting, but not for surrender. The wheels of Flight 917 screeched against the tarmac, and the moment the cabin jolted from touchdown, the atmosphere changed. No one clapped. No one spoke. The silence inside felt denser than the storm of tension that had filled the air minutes earlier. The plane slowed, the engines humming in a hollow rhythm as if bracing for what was about to unfold. Redden Mars stood upright at the front of the aisle, his hand still resting near the strap, holster tucked beneath his uniform. His eyes remained locked on Arian Kelvern, who hadn't moved an inch since the descent began, his arms shielding Laron, whose tiny head was nestled against his father's chest. Remain seated. The captain's voice crackled through the overhead speakers, sharper now, strained. Security personnel will board shortly to handle a passenger incident. All travelers are to stay in their seats until further instructions. Arian didn't flinch, but his grip on Laron's carrier strap tightened. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from a need to stay alert. He had expected this. The captain, clearly trying to shape the moment, wanted the first words heard on the ground to echo the lie already written in the crew's version of events. The final act of a manipulated performance. But Talvin stood. Seat 11C creaked as the off-duty auditor rose deliberately, his voice cutting through the cabin like a clean blade. That will not be necessary. The entire flight has been recorded from multiple angles. Every second of misconduct has already been synced to an external server. Gasps broke through the silence like shattering glass. Two attendants exchanged wide-eyed glances near the galley, their postures stiffening as if realizing, too late, that the power dynamic had reversed. Redden's jaw flexed, but he didn't speak. He didn't have to. His grip on the restraints in his hand said enough. But even those fingers hesitated now, twitching with uncertainty. The plan was unraveling, and everyone could feel it. Arian rose slowly. He didn't rush. Every motion was deliberate, as if the ground beneath his feet would only accept his steps if taken with absolute control. He shifted Laron, now half asleep, into a more secure hold. His son's face was pressed softly against the collar of his father's jacket, unaware of the courtroom forming around them in real time. "I'll walk off this plane as a father," Arian said, low but audible, "not as your narrative." He turned toward the front. Before he could take a step, two uniformed ground officers appeared at the jet bridge door. But instead of following the captain's directive, one of them raised his hand calmly and asked, "Who is the federal investigator on board?" The silence swelled again. Then from seat 3A, the systems investigator, the quiet man who had remained still the entire flight, rose and presented his badge without hesitation. "Here," he said, his voice resolute, "and I need to speak with your supervisor immediately." The officers nodded and stepped aside, allowing him through. The captain appeared in the galley doorway, clearly thrown by the shift in authority. "This is a matter of onboard conduct," he began, but the lead officer shook his head. "This is now a federal matter," he replied firmly, "and you're no longer in command of this aircraft." The captain's face paled. Redden tried one last move. He stepped into the aisle, gesturing broadly as if performing for a silent jury. "I followed standard threat protocols." The passenger was erratic, refused orders. "You're lying." A voice cut in from the middle rows. Then another, and another. One by one, passengers stood up. One man held up the pin camera between two fingers like a sword of truth. The blinking blue light reflected off several faces nearby. "We saw everything," he said clearly, "and we're not letting this man take the fall." Redden froze, breath shallow, hands now visibly shaking. The power he once clung to so tightly was dissolving in plain sight. One of the ground officers leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "Level 7 liability." The words were quiet, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. Even Arian caught the term. He didn't know the full meaning yet, but the tone confirmed it was something catastrophic, severe enough that even senior executives wouldn't be able to cover it up. Whatever had happened aboard this plane had surpassed protocol. It had become legacy-threatening. Arian stepped forward. Each motion was a quiet defiance. The rubber of his shoes met the floor like gavel strikes in a courtroom still forming around him. The jet bridge waited just beyond the threshold, an archway not of escape, but of reckoning. Redden didn't speak again. He simply watched, lips pressed tightly, eyes following the man he had tried to silence as he walked past him, tall, unshaken, and with his child safe in his arms. Arian didn't look back. He didn't need to. The truth had already made it further than any of them expected, and now it walked with him. The moment his foot touched the ground, justice finally had a place to stand. The metal door clanked shut behind Arian with a finality that matched the weight in his chest. The sterile investigation room smelled faintly of recycled air and antiseptic, but it was the silence that hit harder than anything. No engine noise, no crillas, just the hum of overhead lights. 3 uniformed ground officers sat at a rectangular table, their expressions unreadable, and flanked beside them were Talvin, cool and composed, and the federal investigator, who gave Arian a nod that felt more like an oath than a greeting. Laron lay asleep against Arian's chest, his tiny frame finally resting after the trauma midair. Arian kept one palm cupped across his back protectively. No one spoke at first. One of the officers gestured toward the chair at the far end. Arian sat carefully, eyes sharp, every muscle in his body still on alert. "Mr. Kelvern," one officer began, adjusting the playback tablet. "We'll start with what your jacket camera captured. We've synced all 3 sources, yours, the pen device submitted by a passenger, and the investigator's live feed." Arian gave a single nod, his lips tight. "Show it," he said calmly, though his pulse still hadn't found a rhythm. The screen illuminated. The room dimmed. First came the humming, the gentle sounds of Arian trying to soothe his son. Then the confrontation. Redden's voice, sharp, accusatory, cut through the silence. The footage played without edits. The jolt, the scream, Arian's body seizing while holding Laron. The flight attendant stepping back with unsettling calm. Multiple gasps echoed faintly from other passengers caught on ambient audio. Arian clenched his jaw. His eyes didn't leave the footage. He wanted them to see everything. The exact moment he chose to absorb the voltage instead of dropping his son. The restraint, the pain, the injustice. One of the officers leaned forward. "The device Redden used," he muttered, "isn't even listed under any approved in-flight enforcement tools." Another officer scribbled something onto a tablet. Talvin folded his arms slowly, his voice flat. "Not only unauthorized, but illegal if deployed without provocation, which we've now proven never occurred." The tension in the room thickened just as the door burst open. The captain stormed in, red-faced and flustered. "This isn't over," he said loudly. Mr. Kelvern was flagged. He triggered a safety threat during flight. "I have authority to—" "You have nothing," the investigator cut in coldly, rising to his feet. His badge glinted under the light. "Every recording disproves that claim. Every second of it." The captain faltered, eyes darting to the screen, still playing the final moments of descent, Arian shielding Laron as Redden reached again with his wrist restraints. The captain's voice shrank. He was resisting. He was surviving. Talvin snapped. "And you? You were trying to bury it before we landed." The silence was heavier now. The captain's mouth opened again, but the officer nearest to him waved him off without a word and turned to Arian. "Mr. Kelvern," he said quietly, "we've seen enough, but there's something else you should hear." Talvin reached into his folder and slid a printed sheet across the table. It bore a timestamp from earlier that morning. "I received this anonymously," Talvin said. "Encrypted file. No subject line. It mentioned your name. And a warning. A setup might occur during your flight." Arian narrowed his eyes, the realization settling in his chest like stone. "Someone knew this was coming," he said slowly, "and they tried to stop it without exposing themselves." The investigator nodded. "That tip is what prompted my presence. Someone embedded in the airline's operations knew this was bigger than an overzealous crew member. So it was premeditated," Arian said. "Not random, not reactive. I was marked." A pause hung in the air like suspended breath. "Marked by who?" Arian asked. "And why me?" Talvin leaned forward. "Your email last month about a falsified maintenance report. The one that got quietly buried after a review. That may have placed you on someone's radar." Arian remembered it now. The warning he sent. The silence that followed. The way internal responses suddenly cooled in tone afterward. The officer stood slowly. "We'll be suspending the entire flight crew pending deeper inquiry," he stated. "You'll be asked to remain available for formal testimony, Mr. Kelvern." Arian nodded. "You'll have it. Every word." He looked down at Laron, still sleeping, his breath warm against Arian's chest. The contrast of that peace against the brutality they had just endured tore something open inside him and fortified something else. He glanced around the room, then back to the screen, now dimming to black. This was not just about surviving anymore, not even about justice. It was about making sure this never happened again. Not to any father, not to any child, not at 30,000 feet or anywhere else. His voice, when it came, was soft, but it landed like a verdict. The truth had escaped its cage, and nothing could pull it back in. The phone call came at 7:43 a.m. sharp. Arian Kelvin, still in the hotel room assigned by airport authorities, answered with one hand while holding Laron against his shoulder. The infant's breath was warm and even, asleep at last after a night that had shattered every definition of safety Arian once held. "Arian," said the voice on the line, low and urgent. It was Draven Kellis, his legal advisor. "It's out." Arian didn't need to ask what. He stepped closer to the window, the soft hum of early traffic below filling the silence. "Which part?" "All of it," Draven said, his tone like a loaded gavel. "The footage, the scream, the jolt, your face when it hit you. It's circulating across 5 networks and climbing. One of the passengers sent it to a media group anonymously, and 2 others confirmed it. You're everywhere." Arian's pulse slowed, not sped up. The exposure was inevitable, perhaps even necessary, but it also meant the storm had begun. He looked down at Laron's small hand curled around his collar, the same hand that had clenched his shirt as the stun device sent tremors through his ribcage. The memory made his throat tighten. "They're going to try to contain this," Arian said quietly. "They already have," Draven replied. "Valoran Air sent a private communication this morning. They're offering a settlement." Arian blinked. "That fast?" "It's not just fast, it's scared," Draven said. "They want confidentiality, a signed waiver, and an assurance that you'll not pursue this further. A few million, some therapy expenses, and they make it vanish. No records, no case, no precedent." There was a pause. Arian exhaled slowly, anger simmering not from the amount, but from the assumption. They thought he could be bought. They thought the silence of a father could be negotiated like a contract. "They think this was about my comfort," Arian murmured, "not my child's life." Draven hesitated, then leaned in verbally. "I didn't accept or reject. I knew you'd want to see what this really means." He heard Draven's keyboard clicking in the background, then a low rustle of paper. "There's more. I've been digging into Protocol Redline, what Redden mentioned on the flight. At first, I assumed it was fabricated, a bluff. But it's real." Arian turned from the window. His voice dropped. "How real?" Draven didn't dramatize. He read directly from the document. Originally created as an internal security measure to monitor whistleblowers inside the airline, engineers, maintenance staff, inspectors, anyone suspected of leaking reports about faulty aircraft systems. But in the last 6 months, the list has been quietly expanded. Now it flagged passengers who've made formal complaints, raised technical concerns, or he paused, sent emails to regulatory boards. The air seemed to vanish from Arian's lungs. "I reported a faulty hydraulic part last month," he said slowly. "It was a single email. Quiet. No press, no drama. I just wanted to avoid another crash like the ones we studied during the merger." "You didn't know they were logging it," Draven said. "But someone did. And when they matched your name and travel route, Flight 917, they marked you in the system. That's how Redden was ready. That's why he kept using phrases like behavioral protocol, because you were already categorized as a problem." The room darkened in Arian's eyes, not from light, but from the rising tide of realization. He hadn't been assaulted out of randomness. He'd been pre-selected, profiled, and triggered. "They turned safety into strategy," Arian muttered. Draven let the silence stretch, then pressed forward. "This is bigger than a stun device. Bigger than one flight. You're not just the victim of abuse. You're the doorway. This is system-level misconduct. A corporate virus hiding in compliance code." Arian's hands tightened around Laron as the boy stirred. Outside, the sky looked soft and clear, but beneath it roared an engine of injustice trying to run quiet. You'll need to decide, Draven said, more gently now. Do you settle and make this go away? Or do we sue, not just for damages, but for exposure, policy change, and precedent? Arian didn't speak for several seconds. His heartbeat wasn't faster, it was heavier, like something ancient was rising behind his ribs, something that had no price. I'll need everything, he said finally. All documentation, internal memos, logs, names tied to Redline. And I want to contact the Fathers Coalition we worked with during the Varix security reform. This isn't just about me anymore. Draven's breath caught just slightly. You're sure? Arian glanced at Laron's sleeping face, then back out the window where the world moved on, unaware that the sky it trusted had become a weapon. I was hesitant, Arian said. But then I remember the sound Laron made when that jolt hit us. The way his cry folded into my chest like it couldn't find the air to scream again. And I knew. He turned from the window, gaze sharpening like glass, turned under heat. I won't let this be just a headline, he said. We sue. For exposure. For systemic reform. And for every father who travels with fear instead of dignity. Draven didn't reply immediately. When he did, his voice was firm. Then let's rewrite the rules of the sky. And as Arian sat down at the table, pulling Laron closer, he whispered more to himself than anyone else. The choice was no longer about winning. It was about making sure the sky belonged to everyone. The gavel struck once, sharp, final, and echoing through the vaulted ceiling of the federal courtroom, as if it could split silence itself. Rows of spectators leaned forward. Dr. Arian Kelvin stood, flanked by his legal counsel, his 8-month-old son Laron cradled gently in his arms. Every camera lens focused on him. 3 months had passed since Flight 917, and now the storm that had once filled the skies had moved into a chamber carved from polished wood, concrete, and pressure. Across from him, Valoran Air's attorneys shuffled papers and stared down transcripts as if they could rewrite history by sheer will. But the evidence had already been entered, and it was unforgiving. Redemar sat at the witness table, no longer in uniform. His eyes were sunken, a shadow of the flight attendant who once barked orders with unchecked confidence. He reached for the microphone with fingers that trembled ever so slightly. I was following crew directives, he said, trying to steady his voice. We had a flag on the passenger. Protocol Redline categorized him as, "Stop there," interrupted Judge Levon, lifting his hand with quiet force. His tone held no room for excuse. There is no such protocol authorized by any federal, commercial, or ethical aviation guideline. The term does not exist in the FAA's operational vocabulary. The courtroom rustled. Arian didn't flinch. He had heard this defense before, the invocation of orders as a shield for cruelty. His mind flashed back to Laron's cry, the exact moment the stun device hit him, and the way the cabin lights had flickered like nature itself recoiling. The lead prosecutor leaned forward. Mr. Marr, were you instructed to use a stun device against a seated passenger holding an infant? Redden opened his mouth, but found no purchase for his defense. There was urgency. Safety, the footage shows no threat. The prosecutor cut in, tapping the video log displayed on the overhead screen. What it shows is aggression. Directed, premeditated. A pattern of hostility rooted not in safety, but in bias and unchecked power. Redden looked down. His silence was louder than any scream. Arian's lawyer, Draven Kellis, stood with calm precision. Your Honors, let the record reflect that this isn't about a single flight. This is about a system that marked passengers not for safety, but for silence. My client's email, sent weeks before the incident, exposed a critical maintenance flaw at Valoran Air. That email placed him on an internal blacklist. A hidden culture flourished under that list, disguised as protocol, but designed to suppress dissent. The evidence unfolded like a chain. Internal memos, encrypted logs, crew text messages with phrases like, neutralize early, and watch 17D, he's flagged. Each item slammed harder than the last. One judge whispered to another, his eyebrows lifting as he read the highlighted line in a printed report. If he speaks up, shut him down in flight. And then came the twist no one expected. From the rear of the courtroom, A man in a dark jacket rose and requested permission to approach. The gallery turned as he moved to the front. "My name is Aaron Vale," he said, voice steady. "I'm a maintenance engineer at Valoran Air. I was the one who sent the anonymous alert to internal auditing. I intercepted the messages that warned the crew about Dr. Kelvin. Messages that encouraged preemptive confrontation." Draven's head tilted slightly. "Why now?" he asked. "Because the man holding his son didn't back down. Because I have a son, too." Arian turned his eyes toward Aaron. In that moment, no words passed, but something stronger did. Recognition. Two men who had both risked something to protect the future. Judge Levon nodded to the panel. "We've seen enough." The decision came with crushing weight and breathtaking speed. Valoran Air is hereby ordered to pay $100 billion in damages, the judge declared, and is instructed to undergo immediate restructuring of leadership, submit to federal oversight, and implement mandatory child safety and passenger rights protocols. His voice paused for breath, then added, "These will be named the Laron Kelvin standards." The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in something deeper. Applause didn't seem appropriate. Reverence did. Outside the courthouse, Arian stepped into the crisp afternoon light. Laron shifted slightly in his arms, then rested back into his father's chest as if the world had become lighter. Reporters surged forward, microphones blinking red. Draven shielded him from the press. But Arian didn't speak to the crowd. Instead, he looked skyward, the wind lifting the corner of his coat. Behind him, a man in a business suit whispered, "He didn't just win a case, he changed the law of the air." Arian didn't turn. He only tightened his hold on his son, bent his head slightly, and whispered something only Laron could hear. Justice didn't just land, it learned to fly. He struck the father and froze minutes later as the lawsuit was filed, holding the airline fully accountable. If you believe real authority combines protection and decisive action, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the power of legal action and accountability in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and treating every individual with dignity and respect.